So the last thing we're going to talk about in this semester is kind of going to be really familiar, I guess, to a lot of you who've done any work in political science. But it is also kind of a way of tying together a lot of different pieces that we've been looking at over the course of the semester. So what we're going to talk about in this chunk of lectures is the idea of nation building. And before we do that, right, before we talk about building something, we should probably talk about what that something is. So the idea of a nation state is kind of important here in this sort of context. And this is an idea that develops again in the political science community sort of early around the unification of Germany. We could get into a lot of history of that. It's not important for right now. What you need to understand for what we're doing is that the idea of a nation state is the idea of a political organization, i.e. a level of government, that shares the same boundaries as a nation. And when we're talking about nation in this context, in the idea of a nation state, what we're talking about is a group of people who share similar traditions, similar religious values, similar history, similar ideas about the world, similar expectations, all of those sorts of things. Okay, and this is important because especially sort of in that early period around when Canada as a country was being developed, that was understood to be the best way to do sort of stable political entities. So if you wanted to understand why, for example, early on in Canada's history, there was a lot of emphasis on bringing in British immigrants or immigrants who would sort of assimilate to that, and there was a lot of pressure about excluding certain other types of immigrants who were perceived to not integrate. Part of that is about ethnocentrism and racism, and that we're not going to deny. But part of that is also based in this idea that a government is most stable when it is governing a group of people who share very, very similar expectations of the world. Okay? And the reason that we have to sort of start talking about that is that a lot of the work in political science and the like, and sort of discussions about how governing is supposed to work, assume the existence of a nation state. And they assume that a nation state is the best sort of way of organizing a political entity. And that idea is really, really important because it doesn't take you very long working through the history of Canada, whether we're talking about in the past or in the present, to recognize that there is no way to make contemporary Canada into a nation state. There was no way to make Canada a nation state in 1867. There was no way to make Canada a nation state in 1763 because Canada, the political borders of Canada, that 49th parallel up to the north and all that sort of stuff, do not and never did correspond to sort of the natural features that would otherwise sort of divide populations and political entities. This is really, really important to understand because if you notice, for example, in Canada, a lot of our borders, both sort of with the United States and also between provinces, are straight lines. And if you sort of look geographically in Europe, you will find very few borders that are straight lines. And one of the reasons for that is that in Europe, most of those borders are defined based on geographical features. And this is the case in sort of almost every place in the world where borders were defined by the people who lived there. So for example, you'll see straight lines in borders in Africa and in South America, but almost all of those borders were drawn by colonial powers after the fact, so they don't necessarily reflect that sort of geographic thing either. When you look at borders in Europe, you'll sort of see that they're really jagged and kind of wavy. And that's not just because people like to make things complicated, it's because the borders are following the boundaries of natural features that, at least historically, would have sort of created divides between people. So, for example, they will follow the paths of rivers, or they will follow mountain ranges, or they will follow sort of large gullies where things don't grow. Like, there's all kinds of reasons why those borders are a little bit sort of wobbly, I guess. And one of the things is that those wobbly borders allow you to govern in a little bit of a different way, because it means that not all necessarily, but most of the people who lived in Belgium in the 1700s understood themselves as Belgian. Okay? But when you get to a country like Canada, that sort of assumption falls apart. Because even in the 1700s, right, we can go back and sort of talk about, all right, who is living in what we now understand as Canada? And immediately we wind up with at least four groups here, and one of those is a huge catch-all category that really could be disambiguated, but we don't necessarily need to do that right now. So, living in Canada in the 1700s, you have the Francophone population living in primarily Quebec, the Métis population living in sort of a little bit west of towards sort of western Ontario and into what is now Manitoba. You have the Acadian population. Oh my gosh, I got more than four already. You have the Acadian population, so the Francophones who are living in sort of the Maritimes, who have a slightly different sort of cultural identity and understanding of the world. You have a number of English colonists arriving after the Treaty of Paris and sort of the War of Independence in the United States. And you have Canada's Indigenous population. Okay? And despite a whole lot of effort on the part of the Canadian government early on, none of those groups really ever assimilated, right? The French were supposed to sort of give up their religion and their language and just become Anglophone Protestants, and they didn't. The Indigenous population was supposed to just sort of learn or recognize that Western ways were better and just give up their language and culture, and they didn't. And so in a lot of ways, one of the things that is really challenging and always has been relatively challenging about managing Canada as a country is that fundamentally the population of Canada is diverse and there are distinctions between groups of people. So I have to sort of start from there because when we talk about nation building, one of the assumptions sort of in the European traditions was that you could build a nation through, for example, shared history and shared cultural traditions. And because everyone celebrated the same holidays in the same ways, you would wind up with a cohesive social entity. Canada doesn't have that, and so Canada has been much more active in the process of trying from the sort of top down, from the government level, to build a nation. And they've done that through a number of things that we refer to as nation building projects. So projects that were intended, and part of their goal is to create things that Canadians could attach their identity to that didn't rely on that same sort of shared history, shared tradition, shared language necessarily. In that you could have people who had multiple different cultural backgrounds coming together to celebrate, to sort of connect to the same things. And there are a number of those. One of the sort of very early examples is the cross-country railways. And part of that was to create sort of an economic cohesion in that if you create a shared economic interest, you will have, for example, a greater integration and a greater understanding that, for example, the people living in Alberta share some aspect of their future with the people living in Ontario and Quebec, and that those sort of shared interests will be important. We're not going to get into a ton of that this week, but what we're going to do instead is talk about two sort of more social and cultural nation building projects. Because I think that they give us sort of an insight into what is happening and how people understand this issue. So we're going to talk about the CBC and we're going to talk about national parks, both of which are sort of, again, still contemporary. Most of you have probably never ridden on the CPR or the CNR. So, but most of you have probably heard something on the CBC or watched something on the CBC, and you've almost certainly all been to or are aware of national parks. So we're going to sort of work with those two examples this week.